SKYMERGE by Deepak Menon. Planet Rukana. Prologue, the Saga. The ocean shall into the sky merge, and then shall walk upon the barren land the heirs to the throne of mankind. And there shall be no joy in the living, and there shall be no feasts to be laid. And then shall the heirs spurn thee. Thy name shall be erased from the books, thy images shall be splattered with mud, and thy souls banished to a riven hell. Thus spake Ruhan, the last of the doomed Kriels, as towards the sword he walked to impale himself, and fulfill the decree of Ran-God of Johah. And then did Sujakil raise the flag of death, but even as the sword pierced the skin of Ruhan, the skies reverberated with the boom of thunder. Lightning flashed, cleaving the sky into two. Faces of jeering gods momentarily appeared. The crowd shrank back in dismal horror, for the great rain that had no end had begun. Tears of the gods pouring earthward in streams, rivulets flowing red with the blood of their darling. Enraged screams carried by the roaring wind filled the ears of the shrieking horde of the living as they shrank to their knees in prayer. But, as if to show that their prayers were already lost, in the tumults of the wind, lamenting of the wind and sky, thunder ripped through the dark, forbidding air, smashing the words of prayer into the fortress walls, smothering them without even a semblance of an echo, as the stream became a deluge of great proportion. And those who could swam into the maelstrom, while others clawed their way up the fortress walls or wrapped their splayed bodies on the branches of trees. But as though to scorn these futile efforts of puny souls, the elements redoubled their fury and mist covered the land, so that only the screams from shattered mouths were heard. And the fury of the gods continued for full 7 days, till at last, spent and despairing, filled with the sorrow that succeeds impotent rage, a somnolent silence arose. Chapter 1. Ruhan. Ruhan, the lute player, slowly came to consciousness. For some time he thought that he was dead, or that his soul had departed from his body, so devoid of feeling was he. The silence deafened him after the terrible cacophony of the previous 7 days when the storm had raged. Darkness covered the land so he could not see. Gradually, he became aware of the sound of what appeared to be a long-drawn groan, sinking into his consciousness from some infinitely remote distance. It took him a long while to realize that the sound was emanating from his own half-open mouth. Suddenly he recoiled as the events of the previous day penetrated his consciousness like flashes of lightning searing across his brain. His memory hammered his mind with buffeting image of the storm and the deluge. In his mind, there were images of a sword thrusting into his body, images of hands reaching out for his, and then vanishing into the swirling waters, of the raging torrents tearing his body away from the stark rock he clung to with his lacerated hands and ripped out fingernails. Echoes of shrieks rising in the darkness, then suddenly being sliced off as though with a knife. Visions of horror beyond human endurance. He lapsed into unconsciousness again. High above the sky there was a flash of silver. A pair of lovely eyes scanned the plains for any sign of life as a small aircraft droned slowly across the skies. The faint sound of its engines penetrated Ruhan's consciousness as he lay like an inert log on the muddy plain. He lurched to his feet and performed a madman's dance. Waving and croaking, he leaped about frantically. He slipped and fell, came up again, covered with mud, waving wildly at the skies. And the pilot flying the aircraft, detecting a flicker of movement on its computer screen, veered it into a glide to land nearby. Chapter 2. The Bracelet. At an archaeological dig somewhere in the Sudan, in Africa, Saki, an archaeologist, crouched on the bed of a deep trench dug into a gentle mound of earth where some minor artifacts had been discovered in the upper layers. With gentle strokes of the brush, Saki brushed away layer after layer of congealed clay from the small object she held in her hand. Her heart started beating with a heightened expectation as patterns appeared. She continued, delicately brushing away at the object for a long time. Soon a slow smile started at the corners of her mouth and spread across her face. Very soon she had a broad smile. Unable to contain herself any longer, she gave a yell of delight. Professor Damien Hoslop looked up from the parchment he had been studying for the last 2 days and turned his head towards the place Saki had yelled from, just in time to see her head emerging from the pit they had been excavating. Seeing the expression on her face, he rose from his seat and walked towards her. Without saying a word, Saki held out the small object to the professor. Her expression told him all. He took it and walked back to his table, followed by her. Putting on his rather flashy gold-rimmed spectacles, he examined the object. It appeared to be a bracelet. As a matter of fact, there was no doubt about it. It was a bracelet. He examined it minutely. The surface of the bracelet was covered with some kind of what appeared to be symbolic writing. There were intricately inlaid patterns and upraised braiding on the bracelet. Pensively, he took up the scroll he had been studying and compared the two. A couple of hours passed while Saki patiently sat and waited. Finally, with no doubt left in his mind that the patterns on the bracelet were similar to the ones written on the scroll, Professor Hyslop looked up, and his eyes locked with Saki's. "Well?" he said. Wordlessly, Saki shook her head. "I have no idea," she said, "except that it must be over 1,000,000 years old, which is impossible." Chapter 3. Sona. Kerala awoke with a start. Crammed in the small armchair where she had dropped off to sleep, she stared blankly at the bare wall of the small chamber, momentarily disoriented. Her mind quickly adjusted, and she jumped up to go to the side of the bed where the prone figure of the stranger she had picked up from the slushy plains stirred. She laid her palm on his forehead and was pleased to find that it was cool to the touch. The fever that had racked his body for the past 2 days seemed to have waned. Ruhan opened his eyes at her touch on his forehead and looked up into a pair of the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. They were of the deepest hazel and filled with an expression of deep concern. His gaze locked with them and time stopped for him. He felt then that he had been reborn. The simple thought came to him that he had found his destiny. Slowly his eyelids closed and he fell into the sleep of complete peace. All the nightmares of the travails he had faced receding into oblivion. A tender smile grew on Kerala's lips, and very gently she removed her hand from his forehead. She lifted the coverlet and slipped in beside Ruhan, and in an instant was fast asleep with waves of weariness washing over her, smothering her into sweet slumber. When she woke, her eyes finally strayed to the window, and she experienced a slight shock on seeing the glare of the setting sun through the frosted glass of the window panes. Very lightly she lifted his arm, and slipping out from under the coverlets, opened the window, looking out to the sight of the half-hidden sun sinking behind the parapet of the compound walls. For a while she stared blankly at the spectacle. Finally, more out of habit and ingrained instinct than out of intent, she fixed her eye to the periscope and gazed over the walls across the vast featureless plains, bathed blood-red by the glow of the setting sun. Far away, silhouetted almost against the horizon, she saw a shadowy shape. Her eyes narrowed imperceptibly, and her gaze remained riveted on the shape. There was no doubt about it. The shape was moving steadily towards them. An ironclad was approaching her habitat, but it would take some time before it reached Sona at its sedate but inexorable speed of around 20 miles per hour through the slush which covered the plains. Kerala moved with purposeful steps to the front door and strode out into the compound. Crossing swiftly to a large squat stone building in the dead center of the compound, she entered a futuristic scenario. The entire building was one huge hall. Banks of control panels lined the entire hall with a plethora of computer screens and terminals inbuilt into the panels. Crossing over purposefully to one of the terminals, she started to rapidly punch the keyboard. Some of the screens flashed into life, and figures and other information started to scroll up the screens. Suddenly there was the sound of a high-pitched scream of some machinery starting up, which soon settled into a low hum, barely audible to the ear. The huge fusion motors, which powered the complex, were activated. A glance at the status indicators told her that there was enough life in the fuel rods to last her several years, without any problem. In any case, they would be automatically recharged with solar energy every day from the sun. Satisfied, she raced into the compound again. After several minutes of frenetic activity, Kerala soon had the heavy sliding metal gates to the boundary wall secured, and the deep moat around the compound was rapidly filling up with the dark, evil-smelling oil extracted from the earth and stored in the great metal tanks all around the periphery. The moat was very deep. It was deeper than the tallest ladder she had ever seen, and the walls were over 30 feet high and thick enough to withstand any attempt to breach it. Rows of remote-controlled flash guns lined the parapets all around, interspersed at intervals by larger flash cannons. Sona had been designed to withstand a siege, though she did not anticipate one. She felt it was prudent to take all possible precautions against any attempt to make a hostile entry into the fort. All this done, Kerala returned to the room in which Ruhan lay. She drew the eyepiece of the periscope towards herself, and fixing her eye to it, settled down to watching the ironclad approach. Soon her doubts about its intentions were confirmed. Fluttering high on the ironclad was the plain red flag of a marauding unit. With cold deliberation, she reached out for the remote console and punched some buttons on it. A flash followed from one of the photon cannons on the battlements, followed almost instantaneously by a terrific explosion a couple of miles away from the complex, and about a couple of 100 yards directly in the path of the ironclad. Incongruously, something her father had said to her a long time ago, when she had been a child, rang out of some hidden recess in her mind. She must have been about 11 or 12 years old at that time, when she had come whimpering into her father's arms after the death of her kitten that had been eaten up by a groan. Her grief had been inconsolable. Her father had gently stroked her hair till her sobs had subsided, and had said, "To lose our most precious things is our destiny sometimes, child. We were born to travel and search the horizon for worlds beyond our ken. Some of us sometimes fall by the wayside, for no one can afford to be weak. Only the strong and the clever can survive, for this is the way of the world. We must rise above our sorrow, for there are mountains to be climbed, oceans to be traversed, and the vastness of space to be explored. Grieve, but grieve not too long, lest this life pass you by."